afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Garrison Commander, Colonel Jan Norris, and Command Sergeant Major Tracy Barlogio, welcome to Fort Hunter Liggett's 75th anniversary celebration. I'm Chaplain Clay Thomas, and I'll be your MC for this event. It's a pleasure, as always, to see many of our local community partners. Thank you for your participation and your continued support for the troops. A special thanks to our sponsors, IHG Hotels, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, La Quinta Hotel, Quality Inn, Transact ATM Solutions, and USAA for donating the refreshments located in the lounge area across the way. Thank you also to the 91st Training Division for setting up the World War I displays and providing the guest speaker today. Thank you all very much. At this time, the Garrison Chaplain, Chaplain Colonel James Boggess, will lead the invocation.
Please join with me according to your own faith tradition. Almighty God, from the very beginning of human existence, the world has struggled with violence and strife. Throughout the centuries, selfish desires have driven some to tyranny, seeking to subjugate and control others in order to obtain their evil desires. And throughout the past 2 centuries, America has stood as a light shining in the darkness of human suffering, offering hope and freedom. There is much we can learn from her history, a history filled with men and women who answered the call of their nation to defend freedom and oppose evil at home and abroad. So today we take a moment and ponder to consider the men and women who sacrificed so much in the Great War, the First World War, and in particular an amazing leader, Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett, our namesake. It is through pausing and considering all that has happened that we can appreciate the impact and the sacrifices and also the progress we have made thus far. It is through looking back for a moment that we can orient ourselves and learn from the lessons of our forefathers, take those lessons, and use that knowledge to boldly move forward to a future building on the sure foundation which has been set by previous generations. Heavenly Father, may the lessons we have learned today help us to maintain and keep the peace in the future as we strive to make your world a better place. In your name, amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Garrison Commander, Colonel Jan Norris.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Fort Hunter Liggett and the historic Hacienda. General Gentry, General White, Command Sergeant Major Mulholland, King City Mayor Cullen, Councilmember LaBarre, State Assemblyman Representatives Louis Alejo, I believe they're here, Linda Gonzalez, Shane McKeithen, and Javier Gomez, welcome. And we are especially honored to have our guest speakers here, Lieutenant Braafladt from the 91st Training Division, and our keynote speaker, author, historian, Dr. Mitch Yockelson. Welcome. Today marks our second of 3 events to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the fort. And for those who attended the first event back in February, you may recall that we celebrated the pre-military Hearst Ranch era of the land which would become the base. Now we honor the namesake of our garrison, Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett. For some of you who've worked here or lived in the local area for many years, you may know a thing or two about the man we recognize today, but what I've discovered is that most are very unfamiliar with the career accomplishments and impact Hunter Liggett had on American history and during a very pivotal point in our history. Prior to arriving here last summer, I admittedly included myself in that group who knew very little about the man. And so, how fortunate we are to be here today to learn more about his legacy and the great war he commanded in. And while names like MacArthur, Patton, Truman, and George C. Marshall are more commonly written about or seen in movies, you'll discover today that many of them served in World War I under the command of General Hunter Liggett. And I believe you'll better appreciate why this Army training base was named for this great yet largely forgotten American icon. To set the tone for our speakers and our event, I'll conclude with a few quotes from an Army leader you may recognize. And I quote, In all of our wars, we have as a nation entered absolutely unprepared. One would think that such experiences, costly beyond estimate in money and loss of life, would prove effective warnings against repetition, but the warning hasn't been heeded, nor the lesson learned. The old cry, the war that just ended will be the last one, still finds ready listeners, and government appropriations continue to be inadequate. It is usual to blame the politicians and the lawmakers for the lack of adequate legislation and appropriation, but they are much less to blame than the people of the country at large who, through complacency and lack of vision, are indifferent to the necessities of a national defense program in peacetime as well as in war. Our soldiers did well. They were enthusiastic, self-reliant, full of courage, intelligence, and energy, and imposed upon themselves a discipline which was remarkable. Granted, in 1 year's time, we may be able to recruit and train our troops so that they are effective in action. We must not forget that it requires much greater time to properly train leaders. End quote. So, as you listen to those words, a few may have recognized them as coming from our current Chief of Staff of the Army, General Milley, or even our Force Comp Commander, General Abrams, especially if you've listened to their speeches and testimony before Congress in the past 8 months. Many matching words and themes, and you'd be very close, but you'd be wrong. Others may have associated these words to General Omar Bradley or Douglas MacArthur following World War II, or even General Gordon Sullivan following Desert Storm 1, but no, none of them. So those words were written by none other than General Hunter Liggett 91 years ago in February 1925 in his book, Commanding an American Army. These transcending words are a testament to his vision and his intellect, of which you are about to hear much more. So again, thank you for being here today. I can assure you it will be time well spent. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Today's event honors Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett, a decorated World War I veteran. Setting the stage with World War I information is our first guest speaker, First Lieutenant Kevin Braafladt, the Public Affairs Officer and Historian with the 91st Training Division. Lieutenant Braafladt began his Army Reserve career as an enlisted military intelligence analyst in 2009, and upon completion of the Reserve Officer Training course, he received his commission as a military intelligence officer in 2013. He has served as the Assistant Division Historian 2010 to 2011 and is currently the Public Affairs Officer with the 91st Division. As a civilian, Mr. Braafladt is a co-owner of Military Antiques and Museum and the curator of the Sergeant Richard Penry Congressional Medal of Honor recipient museum in Petaluma, California. He is currently completing his master's in U.S. military history at Sonoma State University. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Braafladt.
Thank you, Colonel Norris, for asking me to invited me here to speak today. I'm truly honored. So I'd like to start off with this painting to kind of show a perspective on World War I. This is one of the more iconic paintings painted by John Singer Sargent, titled just simply Gas. This was actually, he finished it in 1919 and is actually now currently residing in the Imperial War Museum in London. The painting is actually the size of this entire wall. So it was truly a monumental piece that was commissioned by the British government to commemorate World War I and the horrors of that war. So one of the things I wanted to ask was, what do we as Americans generally know about World War I, especially prior to our involvement? Well, from our high school history classes or our limited history classes that we've received, generally it's that some Austrian Archduke was shot and Austria got upset and declared war, and then everybody else declared war and Europe kind of exploded at that point. Also that, the war was a war that we'd never seen before. It was on a global aspect. It was the first of these wars that was on a global aspect. As well as it was a war where we were fighting basically mud hole to mud hole. Well, I want to say that there's so much more to the war than that. It was truly a global war. It wasn't one of the first global wars. The English or the British government had kind of invented that policy prior to with this early colonialism throughout the world. But it was a war where everybody had a legitimate claim of self-defense or defense of an ally in this war. It did happen in the domino theory, where Austria, Germany, Russia, everybody declared war one right after the other to defend a fellow ally. And it was a war that nobody really wanted. Germany even mentioned that this was a war that they thought was going to be shaken off, that we thought it was all going to be saber-rattling, we'd have a small little conflict, just like every other past European war. We'd move on, pay reparations, and that kind of thing. The loser would pay reparations and that kind of thing, and we'd move on. It truly proved to not be that. As the war started, this is one of the, actually the funnier things that I'd like to show. This is published by The Onion, which is a parody newspaper. And basically, war declared by all. And goes through and lists all the different countries that declared war, and jokingly says the Ottoman Empire almost declared war on itself. So it's, as Americans, the World War I can be confusing. It can be confusing how it started and why it started. And it was so much more than simply the Archduke being shot. By the end of 1914, after fighting had progressed from, after fighting had progressed from the traditional European war, where armies marched over open fields, charged over open land, but the thing that was different about this war was that it became an industrialized war. There were new inventions, many of them being used for the first time in a major way in this war. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, well-placed artillery rounds were all brand new. So instead of fighting an open war like every other previous war within Europe, they started digging trenches, and it became a stalemate, a war that everybody feared. The German government, the British government, French, everybody feared the stalemate of a war. And by the end of 1914, there were no major strategic opportunities left. Every nation saw that basically we just have to hold our ground and not lose face. Lord Kitchener commented in November 1914 that, "I don't know what is to be done. This is no longer war." So from his comment, this was no longer a war that they knew. And as Colonel Norris said, that we, as a military, or as world militaries, we always prepare for our previous war. And for all the commanders that were involved in World War I, this was not any of the previous wars. This was dramatically different. Amongst all the powers, the only option that was worse than fighting was to stop fighting and to lose face. So it was truly a war that had far deeper aspects, far deeper issues than just the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. Another great quote that I like to use usually is by Churchill in 1923. He stated that the Great War differed from all ancient wars in the immense power of the combatants and their fearful agencies of destruction, and from all modern wars in the utter ruthlessness with which it was fought. Europe and large parts of Asia and Africa became one vast battlefield on which, after years of struggle, not armies, but nations broke and ran. When all was over, torture and cannibalism were the only two expedients that civilized, scientific, Christian states had been able to deny themselves. And they were only denied because they had served of doubtful utility. So what World War I truly proved was that we could industrialize and we could prove the efficiency of killing to its maximum effort. Now, some of the weapons that were introduced in World War I, gas warfare, for the first time that is, gas warfare, flamethrower, first major use of machine guns, and tank warfare, as well as airplanes. These were all weapons and utility and parts of combat that had never been seen before, had never even been attempted before. And so this just goes to show that the brutal efficiency of this industrial complex of killing was brand new to each of the nations that were in power. World War I also served as a test of what humans could endure in combat. Out of World War I, you see shell shock, combat fatigue being diagnosed now. The war was so brutal that it was testing the limits of what a human could endure. Now what I have here is actually, it's a demonstration of what a perfect trench would look like. Now as each of the nations prepared for the war, and as the war went on, they would dig these perfect trenches, each of them having cutbacks going back and forth for serving each of their purposes, for not allowing the fire down each of the trenches. But the things that you see here was the ideal, and in training was the perfect environment. This was actually what was more commonly reality. As the war started, changed from the open fields fight into the actual digging inch fight. It started as basically just interconnecting shell holes, and then digging larger trenches actually into what you see down in the lower right. Just muddy shell holes. And the British actually had a policy through most of the war, the British and the French I should say, that they were not on the defensive, they were on the offensive, and that a trench was a temporary place. That the idea was if you dug in and made your situation livable, that you'd want to stay there. You wouldn't want to go over the top and charge across no man's land to attack the German trenches. The German aspect was the same up until about 1917. Once they actually started, once they started on the defensive in 1917, the trench was the border of Germany. This was their last stand. This was their last effort to defend Germany. So their trenches became more improved, and there were actually, funny enough, there were rumors that Americans captured the trenches at the end of the war, the Hindenburg Line, that trenches had electric lighting. They had dugouts that would go 40 or 50 feet down below the ground. And one soldier actually even commented that as you walked or descended the staircase down into this officer's dugout, that they had windows in the side of the staircase down with pictures of Germany, so that you could see the land that you were fighting for. It's a contrast to what we think of how World War I was fought. It's a contrast to what we see of, it's a contrast to what we see of the fighting that we were always taught. They were just brutal, all-out, efficient killing. This is actually the area in and around Ypres salient, and shows basically what combat soldiers had to deal with. Now, one of the other things I wanted to mention too was that along with this brutal efficiency, that like for example, I had 3 battles here. The Battle of Verdun, which took place between February of 1916 and December of 1918, or excuse me, December 18th of 1916. Total casualty figures was 976,000 casualties for this period in the war. The French having lost some 542,000 casualties, and the Germans having lost some 435,000 casualties. The next one, the Battle of the Somme, was the single bloodiest day in British Army history. 57,000 casualties were suffered on the first day of combat. The amount of land that the British captured was not even enough land to bury these 57,000 casualties. The larger battle took place from July 1st until November 1st of 1918. The overall battle suffered 1.5 million casualties split between both sides. So this brutal efficiency was proven that it was the optimum for what we could fight. Now, before I go to the 91st, one of the things I always like to do too is to show a little bit of humor that the men in the trenches had to deal with. So imagine all this fighting, you're being shelled constantly. As descriptions of the battles took place, that the shell fire never stopped. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year, you would have shell fire. So you had to do something to remain sane or keep your sanity in this environment. Now the British actually maintained their stance up in the northern part of Belgium, northwestern part of Belgium, in and around a city called Ypres, or Ypres. The British were great at renaming basically anything to make it more Anglo name, so they named it the Whitehurst. And actually a Royal Engineer unit that had a gentleman in the unit that was actually a printer before the war found a printing press that had been destroyed during the war. Well, because of that, they started producing a newspaper that was distributed initially illegally within the military, that was distributed to the soldiers as a parody called the Whitehurst Times. In that newspaper, they actually had advertisements in there, such as this one. An advertisement listed for the large quantity of second-hand furniture, only slightly damaged, fire sale today, courtesy Bosch and Company. There was a hall in actually itself, it was called Cloth Hall. It was a huge cathedral. And another ad said, Cloth Hall, great attraction, titled Targeted, brought to you by the Hun. Come see Cloth Hall, the best ventilated hall in all of Europe. Well, basically the walls were the only thing left of that Cloth Hall. Then last, another advertisement was for trench trimmings, decorations for Christmas in 1916, as well as dugout furniture and gifts, with the latest developments in barbed wire accoutrements and shelves. So with that being said, as we as Americans started coming into the conflict, it was actually a shock to many Americans, as well as many Germans during the war, that we actually came in on the side of the British, that we actually came in on the side of the Western Allies, that there were so many German immigrants to the United States prior to the war that it was seen as a given that we would come in on the side of the Germans. But it was more in our strategic interest that we would come in on the side of the British, for the fact that if the British lost the war, they would have to give up, like all other European wars, they would have to give up some of their possessions, which includes Canada to our north, and we didn't want Germany having any kind of possession to our north, as well as being out throughout the Caribbean and some of the South Pacific. So it was important to us to not allow Germany to win this war, and amongst other reasons, that's why we came in the war. Now, for my part, as 91st Division historian, obviously I'm focused on our 91st Division history. Well, we were formed up at Camp Lewis in September of 1917, so we're getting ready to actually celebrate our centennial anniversary for the 91st Division. And we were one of the first American divisions to be formed at Camp Lewis, or actually the first American division. We were the second oldest American division, and just by folklore of the 91st, it so happened that General Johnson, the American commanding general of the 91st Division, his son worked in the office that was approving the newly formed American divisions. Well, his son moved the 91st from the lower position up to second in line. But you don't want to put on first, it stands out too much. So we are, by paperwork only, we are the second oldest division in the United States Army. This shot was one of the few shots that 91st Division has of actually troops near the front. And if you actually go in the other room, you'll see our map, the Verdun A map, which shows Tronsel Farm. And this is actually just after it's in Boggess Mountains, but just after that offensive took place. And this is actually the 363rd Infantry Regiment, was one of our 4 regiments in World War I. Now, so I don't go on forever talking, because as a historian, you know, I could talk for 4 hours about this, and that was the biggest struggle of this thing, 4 years of war in 15 minutes. And as a historian, that's a real struggle. To end my talk, for the 91st that is, this is actually a same shot of the 363rd upon their return to San Francisco. During the war, the 363rd was called San Francisco Zone. And this is actually members of the regiment, after their victory parade through the streets of San Francisco, formed up right in front of the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. Where they're now standing is actually a lake currently. But I've always thought it would be great to reproduce some kind of picture of this, showing 91st Division members in front of the monument. The last thing I want to mention about the war is the important lesson of World War I. Why is World War I important? For all the factors that I mentioned very briefly earlier. It's important because after the Versailles Treaty took place, after the war, it changed the way we would fight. It changed the way the world was shaped. If you look at the structure, it redrew the maps of Europe. If you look at the structure of the Middle East, of Europe, it all draws back correlations to World War I. Now, a war that was, for the most part, considered in America a forgotten war. Why is this the case? A war that shaped us so deeply, and a war that we are still fighting, wars or small engagements, as a repercussion of this war taking place. Why is this war important for us? It's important because not only to remember the men who fought and died in that war, but it's important to us to realize the lessons of what this war taught, the lessons that we don't want to reproduce. So on that, excuse me, on that note, I'll turn it over to our next speaker. Oh. So thank you very much. Again.
Our keynote speaker this morning is Dr. Let me try again. I was worried about the last name and I can't get Mitchell out. Dr. Mitchell Yockelson. Dr. Yockelson is a recipient of the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Writing Award, is an archivist with the National Archives and former professor of military history at the United States Naval Academy. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, and he has appeared on 60 Minutes, Fox News, PBS, and the History Channel. He is the author of 4 books. His most recent work, which prominently features Hunter Liggett, is 47 Days, How Pershing's Warriors Came of Age to Defeat the German Army in World War I. This is published by Now, an imprint of Random House Penguin Publishers. Mr. Yockelson regularly leads tours of World War I battlefields for the Smithsonian Journeys and the New York Times Journeys series, and frequently lectures on military history. Welcome, Dr. Yockelson.
Need the slides? Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's a true pleasure to be here. And I feel your pain about messing up my name. Mitchell has come somewhat of an uncommon name, and throughout grade school and even high school, even college, my professors often call me Michael. I never quite figured it out. The spelling is completely different. But to be here today is an honor, because I've spent literally the past few years looking at the career, but mostly the World War II contributions of Hunter Liggett. And I knew about Fort Hunter Liggett, never thinking that, I would be coming here anytime soon, but I'm really pleased to be here, and the fact that he's being honored as a tribute, because, as I will explain to you, he is the reason the United States won the First World War and brought the United States into the modern age. Of course, he was helped by the first guy that I'll talk about, General John J. Pershing. But really, it was Hunter Liggett who took over the military, the Army, specifically the American Expeditionary Forces, at a crucial time, and led the Americans to victory on behalf of the Allies. And as Lieutenant Braafladt mentioned, it was surprising that the United States supported the Allies and not the Central Powers, because of the fact that there were so many German immigrants in the U.S. But once the Americans got into this war, it became really their effort. And just to give you a brief background, the book titled 47 Days, which I'll give a shameless promotion, I have for sale today. And for some reason, if you don't want to pick it up today, you can get it online through Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I think Costco is carrying it. But it's a study of the Meuse-Argonne. The Meuse-Argonne was the last major offensive of World War I. It was also the largest battle that the United States Army participated in. It covered an area of a front of 34 miles, covering the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. It's near the city of Verdun, is where the main battlefront is. And it would take 47 days to complete. It commenced on September 26th. Of 1918, and ended with the armistice of November 11 of 1918. And the battle itself was largely American-led. Eventually, by the time of the armistice, there were about 1.2 million American soldiers involved in that battle, plus support units, and this included women as telephone operators, nurses, and other support positions. So it ultimately becomes the largest battle in American history. It's also one of the costliest battles. By the end of the battle, more than 28,000 Americans had lost their lives, and about 5 times that much had been severely wounded. But it set the stage for the United States again into the modern age, and becoming the great power that we are today. And I will go to the next slide, please. This is a man, I think you're probably most familiar with, General John J. Pershing. I'd like to give you a little bit of background and set the stage. I want to take you back to mid-October of 1918. And it was Pershing's idea to lead the American effort in the Meuse-Argonne. Meuse-Argonne has been occupied by the Germans since the war had commenced in September, when the actual fighting took place in August and then into September of 1914. The Germans had built up positions. It was a heavily forested area with high ground. In fact, a lot of the terrain is not too dissimilar to what surrounds the post today. I think the mountains around here are a little bit higher than the heights around the Meuse River, but it's very similar. And it was heavily fortified by the Germans, who would use these concrete emplacements with machine guns. They put up wire. They had dug deep trenches. And Pershing knew this was going to be a difficult assignment, but he wanted the Americans to have a major say in the battle. And Pershing was given a lot of latitude. He was selected by President Woodrow Wilson in September, around June of 1917. And he was given basically one order, was to go over to France, lead an American effort, and to come back, and you would fight independently. The British and the French, our allies, were not real happy about that. They wanted the Americans to be part of the British and French allied effort. They wanted them to be amalgamated. That meant that young American soldiers would fight under British and French command. Wilson, to his credit, said that's not going to happen. Wilson, not much of a military strategist. In fact, he wasn't that concerned overall about the military. He knew, though, that eventually this war is going to come to an end. And he wanted to make sure that the United States had a major say at the negotiating the peace table. The only way to do that is to fight as an American command. And so Pershing had a hell of a time when he went over to France, because the French and British, as our previous speaker had mentioned, had been literally bled dry in battles like three major battles at Ypres in Belgium. Battle at Verdun, where the Germans had attacked the French, and then the Somme, where the 57,000 were killed and wounded in one day. That's about 19,000 young British men were killed on July 1st, 1960. So Pershing knew this was going to be extremely difficult, but he held his ground, so to speak, and he kept the American forces independent. But he had a heck of a fight in organizing what would ultimately become the main tactical unit of the United States Army, which was called the American Expeditionary Forces. He wanted to form his own army, and it would ultimately become First Army. He is finally given that latitude by the French commander, Ferdinand Foch, who was also in charge of all the Allied commands, in August of 1918, and then plans were drawn up for what would be a major offensive. It was an attack along the entire Western Front. The Americans would lead the attack on this 34-mile front in the Meuse-Argonne area, but also the British would attack up north in the Somme area, and also the French would attack elsewhere. But easily the hardest part of the Western Front attack would be the Meuse-Argonne. It takes place on the early morning hours of September 26, 1918. More than 3,000 French guns manned by American soldiers fire at the German positions. The Germans suspected the Americans were going to attack, didn't know where, didn't know when, but the attack took place early on, and then a few hours later, the doughboys, as they were called, jumped off. Now, we learned a little bit about the trenches. Pershing was adamant that American soldiers wouldn't fight behind trenches. He liked the idea, and he preached the idea of open warfare. He felt that one of the reasons why this war had been going on so long, there had been so many casualties, as if the French and British allies were hiding behind these trenches. They told him he was crazy. He said, the only way we're going to break through the German defenses is to go forward. So most of the men weren't in trenches on that morning. Some were, many of them were in wooded areas. There were many shell holes in that region, and they had stayed in that area. It was cold and it was damp. If any of you have been to northern France in the fall, you know that it's a cold, damp period, and it rains. In fact, almost every day of those 47 days, it had rained, and there were miserable conditions that these poor soldiers had to fight in. So they jump off, and that first day is fairly successful. Most of the Americans break through the first line of defenses. Pershing had a goal that they were going to reach an area called Montfaucon, which was the highest ground in the Meuse area where the Germans were overlooking. The troops didn't make it that day, but he persevered and he pushed them. Finally, on September 27th, the Americans took that ground. Then all of a sudden, the battle came to literally a halt. The Germans now recognized that this is a main thrust against their defenses, had called up reserves from other parts of the Western Front, fortified their ground even further, and this stopped Pershing's forces. From then on, for the rest of September and into early October, it was a slugfest. The Americans gained very little ground by taking tremendous casualties. And Pershing himself became basically a casualty of the French and British commanders who chastised him and said, you know, you wanted this attack. You wanted to take command of this army. And by the way, Pershing was not only the commander, the overall commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, but he appointed himself commander of the American First Army, the tactical command. And it was starting to, for everyone, including himself, he was starting to realize maybe he had taken on too much of a role. And as we got into the beginning of October, the British and French commanders were calling for Pershing's head. They wanted him sacked, they wanted him removed, and they were starting to talk about lobbying President Wilson and bringing the Americans under the Allied command. But Wilson held his ground, and so did Pershing. And as the pressure started getting to Pershing, finally he made a decision, perhaps the best decision of the war, and that is he was going to step down as First Army commander, but he would still remain command of the AEF. And that meant somebody else would have to take over. And that person was Major General at the time, Hunter Liggett. So on October 10th, Pershing traveled to the front in his chauffeured Cadillac. It wasn't unusual for Pershing to travel and to see his corps commanders and his division commanders. But this day was a special occasion. And he hadn't made this announcement yet, and so he met Major General Liggett. Now Liggett was in command of the the American Expeditionary Forces First Corps. They had been the most successful corps so far in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. One of the divisions under Liggett was the 77th. They were a national army, meaning a drafted and enlisted division from New Yorkers. They had spent most of their time in the Argonne Forest. One of their regiments was a conglomerate. It was put into a battalion. They were later known as the Lost Battalion. They had been trapped in the Argonne area, and they weren't actually a battalion, nor were they actually lost. They had been caught up by German fire and had been trapped. But it was Liggett, as a corps commander, who figured out how to get them out of harm's way. He devised a plan by having the 1st Division and another one of the corps divisions, the 82nd, which one of the corporals in there was a guy named Alvin York from a small area, the Valley of the Five Forks in Tennessee. York would go on to be a recipient of the Medal of Honor. So it was devising this plan to rescue the Lost Battalion that really pleased Pershing. And there was no doubt in his mind that he was going to appoint Hunter Liggett as First Army commander. So he visits Liggett at the front, gives him the news, and tells them, effective October 16 of 1918, you will command First Army. Pershing will step down as commander, but he'll still be the overall AEF commander. Ultimately, this would be the chagrin to Liggett, because what he would learn is that Pershing was what we would call today the ultimate micromanager. Even though he relinquished control of First Army, he was still at Liggett's side, looking over his shoulder and questioning things significantly. Also, Pershing had called a halt to the attack at this time, and so he could regroup his troops, because the Americans were somewhat in dismay. Morale was down, and it was time to kind of figure out how the next phase of the attack would go. A few days later, Liggett would go to Pershing's headquarters in the little village of Souilly, France, which the French had used during the Battle of Verdun. Pershing had made his headquarters in the mayor's office, and I'll show you a slide of that in a moment. Liggett was at this meeting, and after meeting with Pershing, he recounted very little about what went on, other than Pershing telling him that if we and our allies could keep up the gait of the war, the war would be ended by the close of the year. But Pershing made it clear that he was still in charge as an Army Group Commander, which is a term that's more associated with World War II, and he would oversee operations. And then he invited Liggett to visit him later on, also in Souilly. Liggett would bring with him his aide, Colonel Pierpoint Stackpole. Pershing would travel around the Western Front on a special rail car, a special train designed for him. So Liggett, his aide, Pershing, and his chief of staff, Utram, had dinner that evening in Pershing's rail car, and they kind of set the stage for what was going to happen in the war. Pershing told him that the current attacks would cease until there was a reorganization was finalized, and then they would commence later on in October, sometime around the 17th. Pershing said that from this point there would be no let-up in the fighting. After this firm discussion, they retired to Pershing's office in Souilly. Frederick Palmer, who was a war correspondent who wrote about the war, both about the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, and just about his experience as a war correspondent, had been in that office, this little stuffy room that he called. And he said that when Liggett emerged from the meeting, his face glowing, his eyes sparkling as though he had seen a vision come true. And this is exactly what happened. This was the spark that the American Expeditionary Forces, in particular First Army, needed. They needed somebody like Hunter Liggett to give it the push that they had, that they really were desperately in need of. And Liggett was right commander for this job. He had all the necessary traits that an Army leader needed. And now he was going to have about 1 million men under his command. No other commander had that many soldiers assigned to him. So this was going to be a huge responsibility. Liggett was known as a brilliant tactician and corps commander. He had impressed Pershing, and for the most part, the other Allied commanders, especially the French, as this wonderful tactician who understood armies and understood battles. Pierpoint Stackpole, again, Liggett's aide, who was a Boston attorney in civilian life, who was appointed to Liggett once the war commenced, recorded a wonderful diary about Liggett. In fact, it's really, other than Liggett's 2 books, it's really the best source we have about Hunter Liggett during the war. And he's very crass in his diary. He criticizes many of the other American Army officers, but he's very supportive of Liggett, and he basically he gives the best descriptions of what Liggett did day in and day out. Years before the war started, Liggett had studied military tactics at the Army War College when it was in Washington, and then he was at the Commanding General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. And there, Liggett had devoured maps of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War in Sedan especially. And Sedan had turned out, it was an important strategic area for the French because they had lost it in 1871. And many say the Franco-Prussian War was one of the main reasons why the French were so eager to go to war against the Germans. And as it turned out, it was a strategic area that Liggett would have a major say in capturing later on in the war. Prior to the Meuse-Argonne, Hunter Liggett's corps, his first corps, had been the only corps to participate in a major offensive. Back in July on the Chateau-Thierry front, which is along the Marne River, his divisions attached to the front stopped the German advance along the Marne and basically had saved Paris. The Germans had been undergoing a major offensive to try and take Paris before the Americans really built up their forces. And without the 3rd Division, which became known as the Rock of the Marne under Liggett's corps command, had they not stopped the Germans at that point, it's hard to say. As historians, we like to look at all the what-ifs, but it's quite possible that the Germans could have sued for peace at that point. This also made Liggett the most experienced combat officer in 1st Army. Even though he didn't really look the part, as the war progressed, he proved himself as the most competent field commander in the U.S. Army. He was a graduate of West Point 7 years before Pershing had gone there. And like his boss, he had honed his skills during the Spanish-American War and during the Philippine insurrection. He came to France in April 1917 as commander of the 41st Division. That was a training division, a reserve division that was going to be used basically as feeder for the other combat divisions. And eventually it was broken up, and then Pershing had seen his skill and appointed him 1st Corps commander in January 1918. At first glance, though, when you look at Liggett, he appeared rather rotund and perhaps kind of lazy. He didn't fit the description of what General Pershing liked in a commander. You can see how fit and trim he was. His weight was certainly in sharp contrast to how Pershing had visioned what a true commander could be. In fact, Pershing was a little dismayed by him, and at one point in 1917, he had considered sending him back to the United States because he thought overweight commanders couldn't handle the pressure of the war. And in fact, a number of them had been canned by Pershing. But there was something about Liggett that Pershing saw in him and that kept him. But Liggett was also very concerned about this aspect of his life. In fact, when he was assigned 1st Corps, he had an office at Chaplain, which is where the AEF headquarters were in southeastern France. And he would often take long morning walks to try to lose weight. Problem was, whatever calories he burned were replenished later on thanks to his personal cook, who was an immigrant Greek candy maker from Seattle, who had joined the Army as his path towards citizenship. No matter Liggett's weight or his personal problems, and he did have a fair number of health issues during the war, it was again his skill as a tactician that had impressed Pershing. Again, Frederick Palmer, who seemed to have an affinity for Liggett, described him this way: if ever a soldier looked as though he could eat 3 square meals a day without indigestion, it was Liggett. Yet at the same time, though, Liggett had impressed Palmer. Over 6 feet in height and generously built, his majestic figure would attract attention in any gathering. There was a depth of experience shining out of his frank eyes, and he radiated nobleness, poise, and positive energy. Next slide, please. Here is Liggett at his 1st Army headquarters in Suyi. Go back just a second. And you can go and visit the headquarters now. It's still the mayor's office in this little village in France near Verdun. The entire wall was covered with tactical maps, and you can see every other sort of map in front of Liggett. Next slide. Here's Pierpoint Stackpole, who was Liggett's aide, who pretty much kept him on target for most of the war. His diary, like I said, is wonderful. It's in the possession of Virginia Military Institute, although part of it has been published, and I quote from it liberally in my book. So Liggett, now in charge of 1st Army, devised the next phase of the Meuse-Argonne battle, basically the 3 stages. First, there would be a major attack which would commence in early October. Then the main thrust would happen on November 1st of 1918. The pursuit of the American forces would hope that the Germans would fall back and then force them across the Meuse River. Here is where Liggett would have to get the troops in line and make sure that morale was in tip-top shape. He felt, though, for the most part, that morale of 1st Army was very high and all eager were to advance. And he had great success, and he had great admiration for the men now under his command. Next slide, please. Here is where he made his headquarters in Suyi. There were other buildings there that housed a hospital. There was a prisoner of war pen. Colonel, later Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, who led the AEF Air Corps, also had his office there. He was a constant figure in Liggett's office. Liggett couldn't stand Billy Mitchell, found him to be a braggart, and basically a pain in the behind, and you can see that throughout Stackpole's diary. Also housed at this complex was a facility for the so-called Hello Girls. They were American civilians who worked for the Bell companies that spoke fluent French, were brought over by Pershing to help with communications. Communications, just like in any war, were essential. Part of the problem that Pershing discovered was most of the operators assigned to him, they were French women. They could speak very little English, and so he wanted American women who not only could speak French but also could handle the rigors of warfare, and they set up their facility there in Souilly. Next slide, please. Here is Liggett soon after he has been promoted to the rank of Lieutenant General. And along with Liggett, Pershing had also formed Second Army, and that was going to be led by now Lieutenant General Robert Lee Bullard. And I noticed in walking around this morning there is a Bullard Avenue. I'm assuming that it's named for Bullard. But the main thrust of the battle was going to be under Liggett, under First Army. Next slide, please. What Liggett inherited, not only were there a million soldiers under his command, but there was much disarray. There were 3 roads leading to the front, and logistics became a nightmare. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk how it rained significantly. The roads were clogged, and getting troops to the front, getting supplies to the front, especially water and food, was difficult. And so you had significant problems of straggling. It wasn't as though the American soldiers were cowards, that they were deserting. Many of them had gone searching for food, searching for water in this dense area in the Argonne Forest and along the Meuse River. And so, next slide, please. So Liggett had to devise ways of getting more supplies to the front. And even though it was a modern army at the time, they had to revert back to some of the 19th century tactics, such as using handheld limbers to take the wounded back to the field hospitals, and then eventually, in some cases, to the general hospitals, depending on how badly they were wounded. Next slide. Also bringing supplies to the front. Donkeys, mules, horses, whatever animals that Liggett's troops could muster, they were used for bringing supplies forward. You could see how rough the roads were. Not only were they muddy, but they were also shell cratered. The Germans, knowing that the Americans were going to rely on them, aimed their artillery on these roads, creating these huge craters. The American engineers, who really were a godsend to the Army, would have to go out mostly at night when the fighting had stopped. They could do this under the cover of darkness, would grab stones and grab wooden planks from houses in the area to cover up the roads in order to keep traffic moving forward. Next slide, please. But one of the things that Liggett was insistent upon was using the military police, taking them from some of the rarer areas, bringing them front, and putting them at crossroads. That way, if soldiers who had been disengaged from their units, who had been straggling, they could get with the military police, and then they would get back to their units, which was important. And one of the most significant problems that Liggett encountered, next slide, was the influenza epidemic. By the time the Meuse Argonne, it was well into its 3rd phase, and somewhere, the numbers aren't exact, but roughly 43,000 American soldiers were impacted by the flu. In many cases, it was misdiagnosed. It was first thought maybe it was pneumonia. And there were a problem of treating these soldiers. The flu had been brought to Europe and turned into a pandemic. It was called the Spanish flu. That's a misnomer. It was reported in the Spanish newspaper, so that's how it became known as the Spanish flu. It did not start in Spain. It's believed it was started at Camp Funston in Kansas. American troops brought it to the East Coast, spread like wildfire there, and then when they got on the troop transport ships in 1918, they brought it overseas, and then in the war zone with all the close encounter fighting, the flu ended up spreading and spread throughout Europe. It became a significant problem for Liggett. Luckily, he had more replacements coming in. Problem with the replacements, many of them hadn't trained accurately with guns. They had used wooden guns. They didn't have the experience. And so by the time that the battle gets into November of 1918, many of these soldiers had never fired their gun, much less seen the enemy. But indeed, as Liggett had planned, the battle had commenced into November. The Americans launched a major offensive. Next slide, please. And started crossing through, breaking through the wire, and with thrust in against the German positions, drove the Germans back across the Meuse River, while the other Allies were making progress on the other parts of the Western Front. Germany basically said, enough is enough. They had sent out peace feelers. President Wilson had come up with 14 points that he believed that the French would abide by in the event of a surrender. Negotiations went on behind the scenes, and as the Americans moved forward and pushed the Germans further back, Pershing wanted to actually take the American army into Germany and solidly beat the German army. The other Allied commanders insisted that we not do that. They had been in the war for much longer. They wanted the war to come to an end. So it was agreed upon that there was going to be an armistice. Now, as you know, an armistice is not a surrender. An armistice is the end of a battle, the end of a war. So it was agreed upon that on November 11th and early in the morning, the war would come to an end as an armistice. But there was fear that the Germans weren't going to abide by the armistice. It was set for 11 a.m., and Liggett was given instructions that you will continue attacking right up to 11 a.m., and that's what he did. The 91st Division, which we heard a little bit about, also the 2nd Division, which included 2 regiments of Marines, continued fighting across the Meuse River. At this point, the Germans were in the high ground. Picture the mountains around here, surrounded by Germans. They're firing, still firing down upon the Americans as they're crossing over the river, and casualties remained high up until 11 a.m. Next slide. Word was reached to the front that the fighting had ceased at 11 a.m., even though still a little fighting lingered afterwards. But the battle ostensibly was over, and because the Germans were soundly defeated in the Meuse-Argonne area, this meant that the war itself was basically over. The Meuse-Argonne proved to be an important supply area for the Germans, and they knew that had they lost that, they would lose the war, and that's exactly what happened. It was Liggett's first army that led this attack, and at the end, he had inflicted more than 100,000 casualties on the Germans over the course of the 47 days. He captured 26,000 of their prisoners, took more than 300 of their enemy cannons or artillery, and about 3,000 of their machine guns. Machine guns were deadly weapons used by the Germans against the Americans. After the armistice, Liggett commanded 3rd Army in Germany for a year and a half during the occupation period, which would last actually into about 1922. And then in 1920, he returned home, and he was brought before Congress up on Capitol Hill, because Congress, which they like to do, is investigate what happens during the war. And they wanted to know, why were there Americans still attacking on the morning of November 11th, even though it was agreed upon, at least in theory, that the war was going to come to an end. So Liggett testified, and he said that basically, the order to stop fighting for 11 o'clock would have been made only by Marshal Foch, who was the German commander. So Liggett was saying, we didn't know whether or not the Germans were going to accept the armistice. The war was still on as far as we were concerned. Later on, after the war, we talked a little bit about this. Colonel Norris mentioned it. Liggett publishes 2 books about his service. The first, the AEF, 10 years ago in France, and then he wrote Commanding the American Army. Both, in my opinion, are very well written and accurate accounts of the AEF. I compared a lot of what Liggett wrote to the official AEF records that exist now at the National Archives where I work, and there was nothing that that Liggett had embellished. Pershing, on the other hand, had written his memoirs, My Experiences in the War, And as one reviewer said, it sounded as though Pershing was the only soldier on the Western Front. He talked exactly as though he had fought the war all by himself. But Liggett, on the other hand, talked more candidly about the defects of the American operation of the battle, which he said were such as were humanly inescapable in a not yet fully seasoned army, which was true. The Americans were relatively green. But by the time that Liggett had taken command, they were seasoned troops. They were the best soldiers on the Western Front. Had the war continued into 1919, the Americans would have been the main belligerent on either side, and easily it would have been the Americans steamrolling over the Germans had they remained in. And he would continue to say, you know, that these troops were thrown on a few weeks' notice against a first-class enemy at its most vital and therefore most fiercely defended front. In order to carry out a general strategic plan, we made our mistakes, Liggett said candidly, but given the conditions, acquitted ourselves most honorably in my judgment. Liggett would pass away in 1935, only 17 years after the armistice, which is a really short life. A number of Army commanders had died around the time. It was a very rough existence and a lot of stress. It's hard to say why Liggett died, but upon hearing of his death, General Pershing said this: "I'm deeply grieved. He participated in all major engagements of our armies in France and left a stamp of high character on every unit he ever led." Less than 4 years later, in 1938, Liggett's widow Harriet was destitute. She lived on a government pension of $30 a month in a San Francisco hotel room adorned with photographs of her late husband at places where he had posted during his long Army career. A bill was raised in Congress a bill was instituted in Congress to raise the pension to $100 a month for Mrs. Liggett, as well as 8 other widows of ranking officers who passed that year, and it was passed by both houses of Congress. Unfortunately, in 1939, FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, vetoed the bill. She died a year later. So in closing, in talking about Hunter Liggett, why this post is named for him, we've already talked about the legacy of World War I and why it shouldn't be forgotten. But in next April, when we commemorate the U.S. entrance into the war, April 6th of 1917, it's important to talk about not only the U.S. Army, but the fact that the Americans were the main reason why this war came to an end when it did, and the main reason was Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett. He helped turn the tide for the Allies. His chief of staff at the time, who later became Army chief of staff, and I believe the reason why this post was named for Liggett, said this about Hunter Liggett: "With the exception of General Pershing, General Liggett did more to bring about our victory in the World War than any other American officer." Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Yockelson. The command group has a presentation to make to you. The Department of Army's Certificate of Appreciation is awarded to Dr. Mitchell Yockelson in recognition of your exceptional support of Fort Hunter Liggett 75th celebration on May 4th, 2016. Your participation as the keynote speaker contributed immensely to the success of our milestone event and made this a truly special occasion for all concerned. Your valuable assistance contributed greatly to the historical significance and overall success of this event. Your willingness to serve in this capacity and your contribution to our community are greatly appreciated. Presented for May Colonel Jan C. Norris, Signal, Commanding.
Thank you very much again for inviting me and allowing me to speak on our great unsung Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett. Thank you.
Lieutenant Braafladt could join us up here as well. Department of the Army Certificate of Appreciation is awarded to First Lieutenant Kevin Barlogio in recognition of your support to the Fort Hunter Liggett 75th anniversary celebration on 4 May 2016. Your participation as a guest speaker and historical knowledge contributed immensely to the success of our milestone event and made this a special occasion for all concerned. Your willingness to serve in this capacity and your contributions to our community are greatly appreciated. Your service reflects great credit upon you, our soldiers, civilians, and family members, and the Fort Hunter Liggett community. Signed, Jan C. Norris, Commanding, Signal. At this time, the Garrison Commander, Command Sergeant Major, Mr. Hamlin, will unveil the 75th anniversary commemorative painting.
All right. I know we stretched a little long. We skipped the break. So I'd like to read a letter written by our gracious artist, Mr. Pete Dawson. Some of you may know him. He's the Deputy Installation Commander at Naval Postgraduate School. He's also a retired U.S. Army Colonel, Signal Corps. So that's a good thing to mention. And he wrote a letter. He apologizes for not being here today, and so I'm going to read that for you, and then we'll provide some context on the painting that he did for us. Again, as a donation. There was no commissioning fee. He did it at his own volunteer effort there. So, dear Hunter Liggett community, I regret my schedule won't allow me to attend either of your anniversary ceremonies. However, I wanted to let you know my thoughts when painting this image. First, though, I would like to thank you for asking me. I remain a proud Army veteran, and I am honored to be able to do a work for Fort Hunter Liggett and our Army. The painting is a testament to the greatest generation who left the comfort of their homes to fight wars on 2 continents for our continuing freedom. I was reminded of my father, who was one of that generation, going up on Omaha Beach in Normandy on the 3rd day and leading a unit in the Red Ball Express, supporting General Patton's breakout from Normandy and subsequent exploitation. The painting depicts the early marches at Fort Hunter Liggett in spring 1941, preparing the new recruits. These initial march formations were a bit disorderly, as many of the troops were in various stages of physical conditioning, and these long marches on the dusty roads were meant to harden them. They were being disciplined to march in full combat gear, which at this time closely resembled what soldiers wore in World War I, with the familiar gas mask on the head. The painted figures are presented to appear somewhat like specters, ghostly as they are not of our time, and we are intruding into theirs. The buzzards flying overhead are meant to remind us that not many of them returned from the long war years. The hills and fields are already turning golden, with occasional patches of green vegetation left where the residual winter water settled, usually by the sides of the road. The historic hacienda is in the background, transcending time and showing its ever-present grandeur over the scene. Thanks again for this opportunity and the honor of sharing one of my paintings with you. My heartiest congratulations on your 75th anniversary. Sincerely, Pete G. Dawson, Colonel, U.S. Army, retired, Signal Corps.
At this time, I'd like to ask Ms. Linda Gonzalez, District Director from State Assembly Member Louis Aleo's office, to come forward to say a few words and present a proclamation in honor of Fort Hunter Liggett's 75th anniversary. She's not here. So we're not going to do that. So this concludes our ceremony. Signed prints of the commemorative painting are available for purchase. I think there are about 30 of them left that haven't been bought, along with other commemorative items in the lounge room. Dr. Yockelson will conduct a book signing in the lounge room as well. And please enjoy the refreshments donated by our sponsors and the displays in the lounge area. Enjoy the rest of your day. I hope to see you at our final event on July 28th. Thank you for coming.
Good to see you.